Inshallah, in this short video, I'm going to speak a little about prepositional phrases in the Arabic language, what we call jar majroor. Like for example, if I say I traveled from Basra to Kufa, what the word from did is it told us something about the word Basra, that it was the origin of the travel. And if you remove the word from and you say I traveled Basra, then the meaning changes. So it's no longer talking about Basra being an origin, but the meaning is I traveled Basra. What were you doing all day? I was traveling Basra. In other words, I took a tour. So the meaning changes altogether. So these are prepositions, and prepositions in the Arabic language, they are part of verbal sentences. So a preposition would only be used if there's a verb in the vicinity. So now the point I want to make in this short video is that there's really two kinds of prepositions, and this is a distinction that often does not get communicated. There's prepositions that exist alongside verbs as a quote-unquote matter of vocabulary. And the example is, like I have here the little green book, the Qasasun Nabiyyin, Stories of the Prophets. So right in the first passage, the Who Broke the Idols passage, towards the end of it, he has two sentences. And if you're like an extreme beginner Arabic student, you'd be able to understand this. He says, وَكَانَ آزَرُ يَسْجُدُ لِهَذِهِ الْأَصْنَامِ. And Azar would prostrate to these idols. And then he says, وَكَانَ آزَرُ يَعْبُدُ هَذِهِ الْأَصْنَامَ. And Azar would worship these idols. So yasjudu is a verb, ya'budu is a verb. Yasjudu means prostrates, ya'budu means worships. Now prostrating doesn't have an object. So you don't prostrate someone, you prostrate to someone. So the detail of prostration is introduced via a preposition. Like in English, it would be to something. In Arabic, it's not ila hadhihi al-asnam. It just so happens that with yasjudu, the particular preposition that's used is a li, and this is a quote-unquote matter of vocabulary. So in other words, you don't follow the convention in English with prostration, and because they use to, T-O, so you find the closest one that matches up with to in Arabic and say ila hadhihi al-asnam, what that would be an error, that would be a mistake. So you have to say yasjudu li hadhihi al-asnam. So why this one? Because that's just the way it is. So we learn it, and it's sama'i, it's heard from the Arabs, and it's something that's a quote-unquote matter of vocabulary. This is what we mean, a matter of vocabulary. So, and Azar would prostrate to these idols. So it's a verb, and there's a subject of the verb within the verb, the fa'il. And the third part of the sentence would be the prepositional phrase, which we call a muta'alliq. And all three of those together would connect and form the khabar of kana at the front, the predicate of the kana at the front. And in the second sentence, وَكَانَ أَزَرُ يَعْبُدُ هَذِهِ الْأَصْنَامِ, it's almost identical. The only difference is يَعْبُدُ, instead of its object, is a direct object. So هذه الأصنام is the direct object, and you can see this on the last letter of the word asnam, that it has a fatha, هذه الأصنام, and in the earlier one it was al-asnami, because li is a preposition, and prepositions, they induce a kasra on the last letter of the nouns that follow them. Okay? But the point here is that the question, why does yasjudu require a preposition in order for its detail to be expressed, and why doesn't ya'budu require a preposition? Why does ya'budu have a direct object? And why does yasjudu, instead of having a direct object, have a prepositional phrase as its third major portion? The answer to that question is that it's a matter of vocabulary. That's it. That's the answer to the question. It's a matter of vocabulary, and we don't try to rationalize it. We don't try to give a reason for it, because silatul af'ali sama'iyatun. The prepositional phrases that connect to verbs as a quote-unquote matter of vocabulary are not to be rationalized. It's just taken as is. And we just see how they use it, the Arab people, and we just copy and model the way they use it. So every time you use the verb sajada, make sure you put a li on the thing that the prostration is occurring towards, right? And again, it doesn't have to correspond to what it is in English. Like for example, reaching a destination, in English, you say Ibrahim alayhi salam reached Mecca. He was traveling and ultimately he reached Mecca. So if you express that in Arabic, it would be wasala Ibrahimu ila Makkata. And Ibrahim a.s. reached Makkah, ila Makkata. And if you say just Makkata, it would be considered an error. Okay, so the point here is that this discussion is relevant in tafsir. And that's the reason I'm making this video, because there's prepositional phrases that are there within the verses, and there's a verb, and mistakenly, if you assume that the prepositional phrase is connecting to the verb as a quote-unquote matter of vocabulary, it will give you one translation. And if that's not the case, then it will give you a different translation. And this is in the verse in Surah An-Nisa where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the miracle of the Qur'an. Like the Jews, they had doubts, and they made some requests, and they said that we can't accept you as a prophet unless you can bring down some personalized correspondence from the heavens, confirming that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking to each and every one of us with a personalized letter that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is my messenger, so therefore follow him, and a letter of that nature should be delivered to every Jew in Medina. So they made this request. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refuted it and responded to it and thoroughly debunked it. And after all of that, he then tells the Prophet that now that the doubt of the Jews is resolved, in all likelihood they still won't accept you, because they're stubborn and because they're racial supremacists, and they have all kinds of a misguided sense of salvation, that they think that they're the chosen people and they think that they can do no wrong, and for that reason evidence be damned. Okay, so that's them. However, don't feel sad and don't feel upset if they're doing that. لكن الله يشهد بما أنزل إليك بما أنزل إليك أنزله بعلمه لكن الله يشهد بما أنزل إليك أنزله بعلمه. If they don't accept you, then that's fine, because your nubuwah and your prophethood is established regardless, independent of whether someone believes in you or doesn't believe in you. And the reason is because Allah testifies, parentheses, to your nubuwah, bima anzalahu ilayka, by virtue of that book which He has revealed to you. In other words, He's granted to you a miracle. He's given to you a miracle, and the miracle is in the book. Anzalahu bi'ilmi, and how did He reveal the book? He revealed it through His most perfect, all-encompassing knowledge. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the necessary being on whom the universe depends, so He controls the level of eloquence that human beings can reach. And this book, this Qur'an, has elements engineered into it that make it miraculous and make it such that no human being, nothing can compete with it. And the ancient Arabians were challenged to produce 3 small verses that matched up with the Qur'an, and they weren't able to do it, and that challenge still stands, and it will never be met. The challenge will never be met, and it's a completely objective challenge, and we can talk about this separately. But the point here is that لكن الله يشهد بما أنزله إليك. However, Allah testifies by virtue of that book which is revealed to you. بسبب ما أنزل إليك. So Imam Al-Alusi, who is the commentator in the Ruh al-Ma'ani, and this is the book here, Al-Alusi Ruh al-Ma'ani, he says, okay, like if you go to Qur'an.com and you access some of the English translations, they'll do it like this: however, Allah testifies to that book which is revealed to you. Okay, you see where I'm going with this? That's a mistranslation. They're saying that Allah testifies to that book which is revealed to you. In other words, He declares that book to be truthful. So if the Jews don't accept you as a messenger, no problem, because Allah accepts you as a messenger. What is that? That's dogmatism. Can you see that? That's not evidence. That's dogmatism. That's circular reasoning, because the whole point is whether the Qur'an is the word of Allah or not. The Jews, they disagree. So if the Qur'an says that Allah testifies that the Qur'an is the word of Allah, then how does that move the discussion forward? It doesn't. Can you see this? Okay, you see this? And you tie it to the discussion that I started this video with, that there's 2 kinds of prepositions. There are prepositions that exist alongside verbs as a quote-unquote matter of vocabulary, and then there's other prepositions that are not like that, but instead they're discussed in the books of grammar, and they bring out attributes of the upcoming nouns. So the first category of preposition doesn't necessarily do that. It's just there as a quote-unquote matter of vocabulary. You use it where it's required, like conceivably, ya'budu could have been the one that needed the preposition, and yasjudu could have been the one that had the direct object. So it just so happens that yasjudu has the preposition and ya'budu has the direct object. And they're near synonyms. Worshipping and prostrating is not very different in meaning. You see? So that's what we mean by quote-unquote matter of vocabulary. So the ba used in this verse, that Allah testifies, bima anzala ilayka, is not quote-unquote matter of vocabulary, because that would mean that Allah declares the book to be truthful. But that's not what the verse is saying. The verse is saying that Allah declares your nubuwah to be truthful by way of the book that He's revealed to you. In other words, He's confirming and He's aiding you in your claim of messengerhood by granting to you miracle. So Imam Alusi in the Ruh al-Ma'ani, he says, لكن الله يشهد بنبوتك بسبب ما أنزل إليك. So the actual prepositional phrase that you would have expected with the verb shahida yashhadu is actually not there. It's omitted. It's omitted. Testifies parentheses to your messengerhood, to your nubuwah, and then the one that's there is actually the ba sababiyya. And that ba is telling us something about the ma anzala ilayka that we could have, we otherwise would not have understood. Like in the I traveled from Basra, from is telling us that Basra was the origin of the travel. So the ba is telling us that the ma anzala ilayka, in other words the Qur'an, is the cause. And it's the sabab, and it's the thing through which Allah testifies to your nubuwah. In other words, people don't accept that the Qur'an is the word of Allah because the Qur'an says so, but instead analyze the book itself and see how it's miraculous. So the miraculous eloquence of the book is what's being highlighted here. And the Qur'an is miraculously eloquent, and its miraculous eloquence can be determined in one of two ways. Either you learn the language and you see it for yourself and you experience it, like the pre-Islamic Arabs were able to do that, or you rely on expert testimony. And if you can't learn the language yourself, then you rely on expert testimony. And it just so happens that in this case, the experts are the ancient Arabians. Because premise one, the ancient Arabians were incredibly eloquent, and this is a mass transmitted historical fact. And we can see this for ourselves because much of their poetry still survives. Premise two, the ancient Arabians were challenged by the Qur'an to produce the equivalent of 3 small verses in order to compete with the Qur'an. Again, mass transmitted historical fact. No Western historian, no secular historian can deny that happened. Premise three, the ancient Arabians went to war and fought against the mission of the Prophet ﷺ, and they risked their lives, and many of them even lost their lives. And that's the third premise. Again, mass transmitted historical fact, and no historian can deny that happened. All three of those things are undeniable. Premise four, the ancient Arabians would not have done that if they did not recognize that the Qur'an is miraculously eloquent. And that's it, that's the argument. Incontrovertible. You cannot, I mean, like, if you understood those four premises, then that's how you arrive at the truth that the Qur'an is miraculously eloquent. So you either learn the language and see it yourself and experience the miracle for yourself, or if you don't have the willpower and you can't do that, then you can use method two. And method two is now somebody can contest and say, oh, if I bring my own expert and they say that the challenge has been met, would you accept that? So we'll say, look, the experts that I'm giving to you are universally accepted. The ancient Arabian, because that's what the first premise was. Like you have to pay attention. In the four premises, the first premise was that the ancient Arabians are incredibly eloquent, and we can see this for ourselves because much of their poetry still survives, and this is a mass transmitted historical fact. So if you bring me an expert that's universally accepted, like the ancient Arabians, and they say that here the challenge of the Quran has been met, then of course I'll accept it. Okay, that's the whole point. Okay, now are you going to be able to do that? Obviously no, right? Okay, so the point behind the ayah, I got a little carried away there. The point behind the ayah is it's incredibly important to make this distinction between two kinds of prepositions. There's a preposition that exists alongside verbs as a quote-unquote matter of vocabulary. This happens in English, and it also happens in Arabic. And those ones are just there, and we translate them based on the conventions of English. We don't try to, so li, for example, li, it normally translates for, or belonging to. But in the stories of the prophets where he says, prostrate to these idols, we don't try to incorporate that because that's not the intent, and that's not, you're missing the whole point if you're trying to translate that li, okay? Because it's just there as a matter of vocabulary, and it's just something that needs to be adhered to when you're speaking, and you don't line up your fi'l with an object. You have to bring the preposition in between, and then the structure will be considered valid. Okay, now which preposition, again, the vocabulary will dictate which one it is. So for yasjudu, it just so happens that preposition is a li. And for wasala, it just so happens that preposition is a ila. Like Ibrahim alayhi salam reached Makkah, wasala Ibrahimu ila Makkah. Now, is it li Makkah? It could have been, but it's not. It's ila Makkah. And that's how these things need to be understood. Okay, so hopefully you found that valuable and you found that helpful. And if so, let us know in the comments. And if you had some trouble with this topic, or you feel that you weren't quite ready for it, then maybe go through the 3 hours of training that I've linked to below, and then come back and rewatch this video. And normally in the course, in the premium program, I wouldn't speak about this that early on. Like, I'd let the book start, and I'd let a few passages within the book complete, and maybe in week 4, I would introduce the topic and give the students a first exposure on this. A first exposure on this matter of prepositions. And then there's more that could be said about prepositions, And the point is not to teach everything up front, because that would just overwhelm the student. But since this is relevant to tafsir, and we are sharing tafsir videos on YouTube, I thought I'd make this little video, and whoever benefits from it, great. And if it's a little too overly complex for you, then I apologize. But the solution is not to panic. The solution is to go into the description and opt in for the free workshop and go through that. So now I'll put a recommended video at the end of this, and you can move on and watch that. And I look forward to speaking with you soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.